Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you so much for continued support. Today's video is going to be my after-action report on the Slayer and the Daredevil playtests. I have been part of about 3 playtests now, where either I played a Daredevil, or I played a Slayer, or I was in a party alongside a Daredevil or a Slayer. And with that, I finally have a good amount of information on how these classes actually play in practice, and I'm able to both confirm some of the beliefs I had in my initial review videos of the Slayer and Daredevil, the first of which is linked above, and it's also led me to conclude that some of my initial assumptions were wrong, and the classes do play a little differently in practice than I thought they would. And that's what playtesting is all about, so let's get right into it. So the way I'm going to do this is I will give you details on what the playtest actually looked like, what the party looked like, what I played, what level we were at, etc., and what encounters we faced. And then I will tell you my takeaways from that playtest for either the Slayer or Daredevil, or both. So for the first playtest that I was part of, here is what the party looked like. We were at level 8. There were no variant rules in play, like free archetype, gradual ability boosts, etc., other than the slight house rule that we used level 9 treasure rather than level 8 treasure. Now, from what I've seen, this is a relatively common house rule for online one-shots. The treasure for new characters table has a tendency of underestimating the value you would have as a level X character, and only gives you value that you would have at the start of that level. So for example, if you're level 4, you start with level 3 items, so no greater striking runes. This is fine in general, but 1, this gives you an idea of what the character is like at the start of that level, but not necessarily what they're like in the middle of that level. So a lot of players I playtest with like to have this 1 additional level of treasure because it gives characters a little more choice in how they build their character, because otherwise there's a lot of limitations in what items you're allowed to pick. This is not a significant power boost, it is a slight power boost, but it's not a power boost you wouldn't otherwise see in a campaign, because if you started at level 8, 2 sessions later you're going to be about this powerful, right? So I do think it's a pretty accurate reflection of what the characters will play like. I was playing a human Blood-Seeking Blade Slayer. Why Blood-Seeking Blade? In my initial Slayer video, I did say Warded Male was the best subclass, so why didn't I put that to the test? Well, I just wanted to play a combination weapons user. I wanted to feel like a Bloodborne character, and Blood-Seeking Blade seemed to be the best way to go about that. I considered using a 2-handed weapon user, say a gun sword rather than a rapier pistol, and then going with the Warded Male rather than Blood-Seeking Blade. In my opinion, that would have played better than the character I built. I just wanted to use the rapier pistol. Because of the rapier pistol, I decided to mix in some uses of specialty ammo since I have access to a firearm, as well as other consumables like, say, elixirs and mutagens, because I have a free hand to use them with. I also picked the Apply Spirit Oil feat, which also requires a free hand. It didn't have a great showing in this one-shot though. I did get to use it. I crit once, and it was a spectacular crit, but I was not particularly impressed by the feat. And finally, the party used a mix of quiet allies, coming from another stealthy character, and keen follower and terrain stalker, coming from me, to ensure that I could easily and consistently have a quarry. This was worth it. In my opinion, it was really easy to get quarries, even in situations where otherwise we would not have been able to. Now, unfortunately, I can't give you too many details about the other 3 party members because they were testing unreleased third-party content, so I cannot expose their full builds. That being said, there was an alchemist, a kineticist, and a third thing that I can't really talk about without giving away too much about that unreleased third-party content. I will say, we had no spellcasters in the party. We had spell-like versatility, right? We had various damage types from the Alchemist and Kineticist. We had various kinds of buffs from the Alchemist and Kineticist. But we did not have the explosiveness that actually having a maximum rank spell slot brings you. And that was a legitimate downside. Because as you know, and as I keep maintaining, the big job of spellcasters is explosiveness and reliability. For more details on that, check out the video above. And without that, difficult encounters become a lot more difficult. I will also say that this unreleased third-party content is relatively within the bounds of Pathfinder's balance, so it would not significantly affect the performance of my Slayer character any more so than just using any other PF2E class would have. Now for the encounter details. Encounter number 1 was a 100 XP encounter where one of the enemies was a level 9, so party level +1, Nanoshard Swarm, and two of the enemies were level 6, Metal Elemental Construct-like creatures. Encounter 2 is not worth talking about from an XP standpoint because we skipped it via role-playing. This might have been risk averseness on my part, but I had not had an opportunity to get a quarry, and I was not feeling confident in our party's ability to take on this encounter because we were fighting, I think, a giant octopus very close to the water. So we just tried to skip it, and thankfully we were able to. Finally, encounter number 3 started at 100 XP and had a delayed 35 XP. The enemies were a level 9 construct, 2 level 6 constructs, and for each of those, when they would drop to 0 HP or fulfill a certain condition, they would release mist elementals of level 6 from the boss and level 4 from the minions respectively, so 100 XP with a delayed 35 XP later. Looking at this encounter budget, you can see that resistances played a very significant role in how this character's damage output would have turned out, and I think that was valuable playtest data because I, for my first encounter especially, had chosen a poor damage type off of my trophies, and most of what I was doing was getting resisted because I had chosen electricity as my go-to damage type for my Bloodseeking Blade, and the entire D6 was getting resisted most of the time. And despite that, I got good performance out of my Slayer, and I think that was valuable insight. Now, let's talk about my takeaways for the Slayer. First, not being able to switch your reinforced options without also claiming a trophy first feels pretty bad. The Slayer is supposed to be a prepared marshal. Well, I didn't feel particularly prepared. In that first encounter, we used stealth, I used Terrain Stalker to get even closer. We recall knowledge the foes. I realized that the Nanoshard Swarm has electricity resistance, and coincidentally, I had chosen electricity as my damage type for my Bloodseeking Blade's trophy, and then I couldn't do anything with that information. I knew the enemy had electricity resistance, and then I just had to run headfirst into it. Now, the feature that lets me reduce some of the other resistances the enemies had, that was useful against the Nanoshard Swarm, but the minions also had electricity resistance, and I knew this before going into the combat encounter. But I couldn't switch around my reinforcements at all. That feels bad. And it feels especially bad that I was then allowed to switch out of electricity after beating the enemy that I was running into the resistances for. I did not feel particularly prepared, and I do think the Slayer just needs a 10-minute activity you can use to switch reinforcements around. Next up, On the Hunt felt fantastic. In a well-coordinated party in appropriate encounter types, On the Hunt just feels like cheating. In the first combat of the day, I was quickened for 4 out of 6 turns. In the second combat we took on, because remember, we skipped one, 4 out of 5 turns is how often I felt quickened. And obviously, Blood Rush was a big contributor to that. I had a quarry for both of these combats. On that first turn, I was unconditionally quickened. The first turn is just generally the most important turn of combat, but beyond that, that's also the turn of combat where it's very unlikely anyone's dropping a 0 HP. So if you don't have Blood Rush, you're almost certainly relying on an ally to crit an on-level or higher enemy for you to be able to be quickened, and Blood Rush just removes that conditionality, and that is awesome. I almost wonder if Blood Rush should be made into a baseline feature of the Slayer. Overall, my action economy felt great. Arguably, too great. And this is not a concern for the class's design, per se, but it is an insight I got into how to build Slayers. Once you're out of the low-level range, you might get overloaded with options that have the Relentless trait. It might feel like you almost don't need the Relentless trait on more than a couple of things because you will always have actions to spare for the other things. I specifically felt this way about Crossbow Slayer. Crossbow Slayer gives the Relentless trait to the reload action, and that is fantastic if, say, you're a dedicated firearms user. But I wasn't. I was a melee character that had a combination weapon. I had exactly 0 turns of combat where I cared to use Crossbow Slayer. I always had a normal action to reload with because I was always using some other relentless action. I was either using Honed Strike, or Shifting Hunt, or Shifting Combination, or Stride, or Step. Remember, those are options too. So between those 5, I never felt like there was a turn where I was both reloading my firearm and not using any other relentless trait actions. And remember, as long as using even one other relentless trait action, it doesn't matter that Crossbow Slayer gave reload relentless, because you can just reload with a normal action and spend your quickened action on something else, like Honed Strike. Even for dedicated firearm users, this might be true. You may end up rarely ever using Crossbow Slayer because you're almost always going to use Honed Strike to crit fish with, right? So once you have 3-ish relentless actions that cover a variety of use cases, you don't need to worry about having every single relentless action on your list. Pick other things. You practically already have a free 4-action economy and don't need more because you come with 5 options built in for that 4th action. As long as the 3-ish picks you make are good and you have Stride and Step available, you're almost never going to want for more. In my case, I should have swapped Crossbow Slayer for Peculiar Weaponry and gotten an Explosive Dog Slicer. That would have upped my damage output pretty significantly. So all that to say, this is not feedback so much as an insight I got into character building. You need to build your Slayers to abuse your 4-action economy. And some of the later playtests where I didn't play the Slayer, I felt like those characters were not built to abuse that 4-action economy, and it kind of showed. Bring consumables, bring skill actions, bring specialty ammunition. Have options for what to do with your 4th action, because on any turn where you're quickened, you're really going to feel like you can do anything as long as you have 2 or 3 relevant relentless actions. Don't pick every single action economy upgrade that has the relentless trait. Once you have a handful of those, you're at 98% efficiency, and your 4th or 5th option is only bringing you to 99%, which is not worth a feat. Spend that feat on something more useful. The Slayer has plenty of relevant feats that you can pick, and you should not just be taking relentless options. Next up, overcoming resistances is obviously a situational thing. Coincidentally, it came up a lot in this one-shot. It's not going to come up in every combat, but it feels amazing when it comes up. Personally, I felt like my character was doing significantly more damage than most martials with similar damage scaling would be able to do in those situations. Overcoming resistances is really good, even if it's just by a small reduction. It feels great. And finally, Honed Strike felt fantastic. When I first saw it, I thought it was just the Ranger's Hunter's Aim feat with a slight action economy benefit attached, because it can be used in melee as well, and it can be used with your relentless trait. This felt fantastic. Firearms are great on the Slayer because of this. It feels like you get to be a pretty damn good crit fisher. Ignoring concealment is also a really good situational benefit. It came up in this one-shot because of those missed elementals I talked about. It's not going to come up all the time, but it feels great when it does come up. But even without that benefit, the fact that you get to crit fish is great. The Slayer has a lot of support for crit riders. I had a free Fearsome rune, I had Apply Spirit Oil, and obviously my firearm had the Fatal trait. And of course, the Rapier itself also has a deadly trait. All of these combined meant I felt incentivized to go for those crits, and it felt that when I was running away and switch hitting, I had high enough reliability that it didn't feel bad. It felt pretty good to use a combination weapon and be a switch hitter with it. So that's all my takeaways from playtest 1. Now let's talk about the second playtest session. First, for the party details. This playtest was 1 level higher than the last. Again, no variant rules, so no free archetype, etc. Level 9, and starting with level 10 treasure. I was playing a Minotaur Daredevil, using a Bastard Sword as my weapon of choice. I also had picked Acrobat Dedication to max out my acrobatics, and besides that, I just focused on Daredevil cool feats. So I got Scrambling Retreat because I wanted to test how it would play out to have that as a reaction. I got Wheeling Pull Stunt. I got Rushing Stride, etc. Next up, there was a Were-Tiger Slayer, unarmed, and I forgot what subclass they were on, but I think it was Warded Male. And again, unfortunately, I cannot give you too many details about the rest of the party's build. We were again testing some unreleased third-party content, but I can tell you, one of them was a ranged rogue, and the other was an offensively built alchemist. The offensively built part is important. They helped us with pre-buffs whenever we got a chance, but they were not buffing us in the middle of combat. They were a very versatile character, but their versatility was focused on offense via things like Bottled Lightning, Alchemist Fire, etc. And again, we had no spell slots because we had nobody who was actually a spellcaster, and this time even less versatility than the last party. Because in that last party, there was an alchemist, there was a kineticist, and there was that third character I couldn't tell you much more about that I can tell you was pretty damn versatile. This party, not so much. The alchemist was obviously a very versatile character, and the rogue was not built to be that versatile, the slayer was not built to be that versatile, and my daredevil was about as versatile as you would expect an athletics martial to be, which is to say, pretty versatile, but not approaching like a kineticist, spellcaster, or alchemist that was built with that in mind. And again, this mattered. This meant we couldn't just punch through the more difficult encounters with a max rank spell slot. We actually had to marshal our way through them, and with even less versatility than before. So this is what the encounters for the session look like. Encounter number 1 was a 7 EXP encounter. One of the enemies was a Doldrum's Heap, and 2 of the enemies were Homebrew level 6 enemies with a mix of pulling, tripping, Wall of Thorns kind of attacks. So they were like tree-like enemies. Encounter number 2, there were 2 level 7 Greater Grodaires and 2 level 7 Tantriogs. This combat took place on a riverbank. Encounter number 3 was 120 XP. It was one boss at level 11, a variant Tyrannosaurus, 1 level higher than a normal one, and there were 2 level 7 Carnotauruses. Now I want you to keep in mind, all 3 encounters had plenty of props. The terrain was complex, there was a lot of verticality, and my Minotaur Daredevil was built to abuse that verticality because large characters are fantastic at climbing using things like Rapid Mantle and Powerful Leap. See more information on that in my video linked above if you're not sure why that is. So my character was ping-ponging everywhere, all over the battlefield, and had plenty of props to give speed boosts with and to get stunt damage off of. So I think this was a really good playtest to evaluate the Daredevil in. How did the Daredevil perform? My big takeaway for the Daredevil is that it felt fantastic. I think the Daredevil is currently in a better place than the Slayer. I made that claim in my Daredevil video, linked above, and I stand by it. I think the Daredevil is really close to perfection. It just doesn't match what a lot of people think Daredevils should do because they're a martial. So they want Daredevils to deal damage, and they're focusing on stunt damage and forgetting the rest of the toolkit. The Daredevil toolkit is a fantastic one, and we will talk about that after we get out of the way that I made a big oopsie on my character. I would sometimes go Daring Stunt for one action and then Rushing Stride to skirmish away from that enemy, strike somebody else, and then have my third action, effectively my fifth action, left over. That is illegal. Rushing Stride requires you to not have had adrenaline when you used it, so Daring Stunt followed by Rushing Stride is simply not allowed. That being said, this is not the biggest mistake. I understand that there might be some hesitation to accept my glowing review of the Daredevil based on the fact that I ran this illegally, but I have reviewed how that combat would have played out had I not had this option, and I would simply have taken those first 4 actions and not worried about the 5th. So this sequence happened a lot in that final boss fight, the one where there was 1 level +2 enemy and 2 different level -2 enemies. And the way I was dealing with this is that I was telling the party, y'all position yourself smartly and focus on the minions. I am going to keep the boss inconvenienced, but I'm an 8 HP marshal without a shield in a party that doesn't have a healer. I'm not going to stay in melee with that boss. That's not okay. So what I'm going to do instead is Daring Stunt in to trip that boss, then get out of melee with that boss, and make a strike. These 4 actions are the most important thing I need to do. And in particular, I always strode into a position where I was flanking a minion with my ally, the Were-Tiger Slayer. The 5th action I got after that was often just a throwaway action. It was not an important part of my turn. It was just a nice to have that I now realize was an illegal nice to have. So all that changed is made the Daredevil go from a brokenly good skirmisher, arguably, to still the best skirmisher in the game. Yeah, the Daredevil is the best skirmisher in the game. So let's take Daring Stunt and compare it to Flying Tackle, because action for action, that looks like the closest comparison. Both have Flourish. Both involve a leap followed by a trip. Let's ignore the other options that Daring Stunt gives you. It's a leap followed by a trip or a stride followed by a trip. And forget the other athletics options. The only difference is Flying Tackle is a 3-for-2 action compression. You get to do stride, leap, trip. And then Daring Stunt is a 2-for-1 action compression. You get to do stride or leap into trip. And the reason it's 3-for-2 is because Flying Tackle costs 2 actions and Daring Stunt costs 1 action. That's why it's 2-for-1. Now, on paper, a lot of people are going to say 3-for-2 and 2-for-1 are equally good. Some might even say 3-for-2 is strictly better. But as I talked about in my Fundamentals of Power video linked above, action economy, when you commit actions to it up front, is actually a downside, even if it's not obvious. Let's pretend you were a Guardian using Flying Tackle for this skirmishing. You would stride in, leap, trip, and then you would stride back out. A lot of the time, the extra movement from the stride and leap was gonna get wasted anyways. Most likely, it will only have been relevant on that first turn of combat. And you wouldn't get to do a second strike or anything with your second multiple attack penalty really on your turn, because you had to stride away with your 3rd action and that ended your turn, right? Now, of course, you're a Guardian, so you wouldn't stride away. You would probably do something else like taunt the enemy or raise a shield. But the point still remains that a 3-for-2 doesn't enable skirmishing in the same way that a 2-for-1 does. The Daredevil can Daring Stunt in, trip the enemy, stride back out, flank a minion, and attack that minion, and no marshal can come close to replicating that except the Monk. Now, the Monk is also a fantastic skirmisher, only a little behind the Daredevil, in my opinion. The best a Monk would do in this situation is stride in, flurry of maneuver as the boss, do a trip with the first strike of flurry of maneuvers and a strike with the second one, and then stride back out. So again, the Daredevil and Monk both got a 4 action economy here. Both of them got to stride in, trip the boss, and stride out. What's the difference? What makes me say the Daredevil skirmished better? The Monk's second strike went to the boss. The Daredevil's second strike went to a flanked minion. There's a massive difference there. The Monk is much more likely to miss their strike and is not contributing to the focus fire the party needs to take those minions out of play before the boss is able to come fully online. The Monk is still doing a fantastic job skirmishing a boss and keeping them away from the party while the rest of the party takes care of the minions is a valid and powerful divide and conquer strategy, and it is going to fall down to a control-oriented athletics marshal if the party doesn't have a spellcaster to use something like Containment or Wall of Stone with. And the Daredevil and Monk are both fantastic at doing it, but the Daredevil is still slightly better. The fact that the Daredevil is skirmishing and contributing to taking down the minions means the party has that much higher of a chance of getting through this fight without the boss getting a turn online and really messing up the party. And all of this leads to my second point. The Daredevil is a fantastic skirmisher, and I was wrong in my previous video to say that the skirmishing is interfering with its character fantasy. It's actually really good. Please build yourself as a skirmisher. Please have relevant 3rd actions for when you get out of combat. Give yourself Demoralize, give yourself Shuriken. It doesn't matter what you do, you're going to find yourself with spare 4th actions, and you're going to want to use them on skirmishing because it feels really good. The specific type of encounter we were facing, where it was a T-Rex in its home terrain with a lot of features that benefit for being in that terrain because it was a variant T-Rex, the fact that I could neutralize the boss's performance simply via Daring Stunt was fantastic. And then the fact that I could contribute to taking down minions after was also fantastic. My gut feeling about the Daredevil being an excellent controller was completely justified. Like I said, no one except a monk has this efficiency, and the Daredevil has that slight win because of the convenience of where you get to aim that second strike if you want to. And no one except a fighter or ranger gets this sort of reliability when your audacious combatant stuff is on, which you would always have the option to use. I mentioned striding back to the enemy and, say, striking them, but that's not all you would do, right? You would also consider using, say, wheeling pull stunt to grab the enemy, for example. Or you would consider forceful kickoff stunt to shove them away from a fragile friend and into a wall or something. No martial controller gets to have both the efficiency of a monk and the reliability of a fighter or flurry ranger for athletics specifically. I know the fighter strikes are much more reliable in general, but when it comes to athletics, the Daredevil is really keeping up with both of these heavy hitters. And because of this, you want your first action to be daring stunt damn near 100% of the time. I don't think there was a single turn in that whole session where I did not use daring stunt. There's simply no reason not to do so. You can always just stride away from an enemy and back, and a lot of the time, because you're skirmishing, you're going to want to stride anyway. So daring stunt is just a fantastic option. I've seen a lot of people undervaluing how powerful daring stunt is and how big a part of the power budget it is. I promise you, daring stunt is the reason to be a Daredevil. Daring stunt is to the Daredevil what something like Champion's Reaction or Intercept Attack is to those respective classes. It is a huge part of your power budget. It's a powerful action economy booster that then brings the rest of the chassis together. It felt fantastic being an 8 HP marshal who can't stay in melee and still get to control the boss. And I don't think anyone except a monk can even come close to replicating this, and I maintain the Daredevil is better. But because daring stunt is so important to you, you're gonna want to max out athletics. But a lot of your feats require acrobatics instead, which really makes the acrobat dedication feel mandatory. If you don't pick this dedication, you are individually spending skill increases to make sure acrobatics keeps up, because it has to keep up. It's really important to your toolkit, and that means you're going to have so little variety out of the maneuvers you take, all of which have the multiple attack penalty. So if you don't take the acrobat dedication, you're going to struggle to use your fourth action well, which means it's a mandatory dedication. It may not be obvious to people yet because the class is new, but if the Daredevil releases in this form, Acrobat is going to be mandatory on it, even more so than it used to be considered on the pre-Master Swashbuckler. We need to get Paizo to give the Daredevil auto-scaling skills to prevent this from happening. And then, stunt damage. Now, I had alluded to this in my Daredevil video where I mentioned that stunt damage is being made out to be a much bigger deal than it is. It's just an incidental boost to something you would have wanted to do already, forcibly move an enemy, and I maintain that. I maintain that stunt damage is a really minor part of your toolkit. I have seen people dismissing the entirety of the class based on this ass-backwards assumption that because stunt damage has the same numerical scaling as finishers, it is as important to a Daredevil as finishers are to a Swashbuckler, and therefore, because it's harder to trigger, it's bad. That is silly. It makes no sense. Stunt damage came up twice in my session. You know what was the most important part of my toolkit? Daring stunt. I would say scrambling retreat was more important to my character than stunt damage. Stunt damage is just a minor upside. In the few instances where it comes up, it's just incidental damage. When it doesn't come up, you're not really gonna miss it because you're not a damage dealer. You are a hardcore controller skirmisher, and you have the tools designed to let you be that. And finally, to evaluate a couple of feats. Wheeling pull stunt was about as good as I expected. It is a good way to grab and pull enemies, and depending on your GM's interpretation of force movement rules, it may also trigger stunt damage. That's great. Wheeling pull stunt was pretty damn good. You know what I did not expect? Scrambling retreat was really good. I mentioned that the Daredevil is a fantastic skirmisher, and scrambling retreat is a skirmishing option. It gives you an AC boost for the retaliation you might take for having stayed in melee and get away from melee. And I had underrated it because the enemy gets to follow you as a free action. And that just feels bad. That means that if they wanted to keep you in melee, they get to keep you in melee. What I hadn't anticipated is that enemies are not just dangerous due to their strikes while in melee. They're dangerous due to knockdown, grab, improved knockdown and improved grab, multi-strike abilities that hit everyone in range, getting to take a 2-action thing that's, say, like a breath weapon that catches everyone near you after striking someone. Every single time you get struck as a Daredevil and you use Scrambling Retreat, aside from the 10 to 20% improvement in your armor class, it's also potentially denying enemies this option. They don't even get to attempt a trip or grapple on you if they had the corresponding abilities, because they interrupted their sequencing with a free action, which means now the last action they took was not a successful strike. If they were going to aim a breath weapon, you might not be in it anymore, or if they follow you, your friends are no longer in it anymore. If they were in the middle of a multi-strike hit, they're probably just going to let you get away from melee and hit your friends, but now you got to get away from melee and you're skirmishing away from them. Your survivability improved despite being an 8 HP Marshal. So Scrambling Retreat was way better than I expected. And while I still think the Daredevil needs a little bit of a survivability boost, I think it needs less than I thought. Maybe Scrambling Retreat should just be made baseline, because I think that would honestly be like 90% of the way there to getting the Daredevil to be survivable enough. And finally, I did not expect that I would miss Forceful Kickoff Stunt. I did end up missing it. That illegal sequence I did, Daring Stunt followed by Rushing Strike. You know what's not an illegal way of skirmishing? Daring Stunt followed by Forceful Kickoff Stunt. Get in, trip an enemy, shove them further away to potentially deny them even more actions, closing in with your party, get back to where you came from at least a little bit, and then position yourself / make a strike, depending on where you are, to continue helping your party. Forceful Kickoff Stunt is way better than I anticipated. I didn't get to evaluate it, but I can evaluate it based on how much I missed it, and I missed it a lot. Despite Wheeling Pole Stunt being so good, I think Forceful Kickoff Stunt might be better because of how good skirmishing is as a Daredevil. So I know this was a long and somewhat complicated look at the Daredevil, but I hope I have convinced many of you that this class is fantastic. It is the best skirmisher in the game, and being a skirmisher is good provided that you're in a coordinated party. The Daredevil is definitely an advanced and complex class. It's not easy to play, but it's really rewarding if you get it right. Now to talk about how the Slayer in the same party performed. First off, this Slayer's performance is one of the reasons I realized that you need to build Slayers in ways to abuse your 4-action economy. Fill your character up with random things to do, like consumables and whatnot, because otherwise, your 4th action is only going to feel like a QL upgrade, not like an actual power boost. This character was quickened on a lot of turns. A lot of the time, the quicken action was just used on something like Honed Strike or Sudden Pounce, and then it was followed up by relatively standard martial things like striking enemies with a lot of multiple attack penalty, or making recall knowledge checks. So I definitely think if you're building a Slayer in its current form, you need to think about what you're doing to abuse that 4th action. And that sort of reinforces something I already thought. The class needs some signposting for what to do with your 4th action. And specifically, I am more convinced than before that the Slayer needs a 2nd subclass. Right now, you pick your 1st subclass at level 1, and a 2nd subclass at level 11, which can be any of the ones you could have picked at level 1. Instead, I think you need to pick your 1st at level 1, and then a 2nd, more minor subclass, either at level 1 or level 3. The subclass list should be different. For example, your primary subclass should be Blood-Seeking Blade or Warded Mail, and your secondary subclass should be Chemist Vials or Consecrated Panoply. And that would basically give you access to some kind of a minor action from your other subclass. Chemist Vial could have alchemical items similar to versatile vials that you get from Alchemist Dedication. Consecrated Panoply obviously has Thrown Knives as a 3rd action. Maybe they can get some other boost, like maybe a 1-action way of sharing your saving throw bonus with somebody else. A hypothetical shield subclass that comes as another minor subclass would obviously have the option to raise their shield as a 4th action, etc. Now, of course, you can still have good 4th actions if you want to. When I played my Slayer, I built in good 4th actions, right? Partially via consumables, partially via my own Slayer feats. But in my opinion, having some of this built into the class itself via the second subclass would be nice. The class would get to sing without you needing to have the perfect build choices. And I think that would be a really good thing for the Slayer. The Slayer will still be a complex class if this simplification is made, therefore I support it. But of course, all that being said, On the Hunt had a really good showing in this one-shot too. I didn't track exactly how many turns of Quicken they got. I don't think it was quite as many as I got in my playtest, just because of circumstances and just because of how long the last combat ran, but it was still a majority. And finally, a valuable takeaway from this playtest was that a quarry-less Slayer still felt very functional. The Slayer only had a quarry for the final encounter, and they still had great performance the whole way through. Remember earlier when I said that I just tried to skip an encounter because I didn't have a quarry? Maybe that was a bit of a negativity bias. Maybe we could have taken on that giant octopus without me having it as a quarry. I'm not sure. This is one of those things which I don't think 5 combats really gives you a perfect understanding of, but it is nice that the class functions without a quarry because that differentiates them from a ranger. The fact that you don't need a quarry to function, the quarry is just like this passive benefit that sometimes happens, is great. And finally, let's talk about the third playtest I was part of. Party details are as follows. We were at level 12, we were using both the free archetype and the Ancestry Paragon variant rules, but we were using normal treasure for this level. So the previous 2 playtests we were using one higher level of treasure, this one we were just using level 12 treasure. I wasn't playing a Slayer or a Daredevil for this playtest. I was playing a Flames and Untamed Order Nari human druid. For the rest of the party, I can finally give you full details on what they were built like. One of them was a Healing Font Cloistered Cleric doing exactly what you'd expect that cleric to do. The next was another Nari, ironically, Daredevil, focused on unarmed and breakaway attacks. Them being a Nari felt pretty damn nice because I was able to set up Wildfire without them being concerned at all. Notably, they were medium-sized, not large like the Minotaur I played in the previous playtest. And finally, there was a Konrasu, Warded Mail, and Bloodseeking Blade Slayer. Warded Mail was their primary, and Bloodseeking Blade was their level 11 choice. And as for the encounter details, the encounters here got a little weirder for the Slayer specifically, and I will talk about that later. But encounter number 1 was a trivial-ish encounter. There was a level 9 Tick Swarm and 2 Titan Centipedes, but the Titan Centipedes were not actually hostile to us. They were being confused by a condition that these ticks were passing on to them, and we had the potential secondary win con of non-lethally getting them to stop attacking us. And this mattered a lot to the Slayer, which we'll talk about later. In encounter number 2, it was a low threat 60 XP fight with 1 Cave Worm. Now, it might have had the Elite template, which would have made it level 14 rather than level 13, and made it 80 XP rather than 60, but honestly, we couldn't notice the difference. We had 2 spellcasters, so you could barely tell the difference between a 1 level higher or 2 level higher boss because spellcasters are so good at punching through boss defenses. And finally, we had an encounter with a level 15 after the weak template was applied, Titanosaur. This was a 120 XP single boss fight and gave a lot of valuable information on both the Daredevil and the Slayer. So let's get into it. First, let's talk about Daredevil takeaways. Titan Wrestler being mandatory is terrible. Let's get the stinkiest part of this out of the way right off the bat. I knew Titan Wrestler was a mandatory feat for Daredevils, and I picked it on my Minotaur Daredevil, and you'll notice that Minotaurs are large, which means I can grapple gargantuan enemies right away without needing to wait for legendary athletics. This player forgot to pick it, and that meant that in the second combat against the Cave Worm, he simply could not use Daring Stunt, and that feels terrible. He still had other risky trait actions, he had Breakaway Attack, but the fact is that it just doesn't feel good for Daring Stunt, which, remember the glowing review I gave of Daring Stunt in that previous slide about the Daredevil, where it's a huge part of how you skirmish and apply crowd control and actually do all the powerful things the Daredevil can do? Well, you can't do any of those if you don't have Titan Wrestler and you're facing a huge or larger enemy. And yes, not all enemies are going to be huge or larger, but come on, like, Daring Stunt is too core a part of your feature budget to then be left up to chance of not facing huge or gargantuan enemies. Now, the GM allowed this player to pick Titan Wrestler retroactively after the second combat, and the third combat had a gargantuan enemy, which meant he wouldn't have gotten to use Daring Stunt anyways. Now, I had figured something like this would happen because, remember, in my Daredevil video, I talked about how large-sized Daredevils are optimal. So I had picked Scrolls of Enlarge to help him with if this ever came up, and I got to pre-buff with it, so there was no real cost to it, thankfully. But Titan Wrestler needs to be built into the Daredevil's budget, and it probably just needs to be stronger than basic Titan Wrestler. Just let medium-sized Daredevils grapple gargantuan enemies at level 7. It's a thematic fit. They're crazy people who are trying to do things that nobody else would attempt until way later in the level scale, right? And Titan Wrestler needs to apply the stunts too. If those feats at least mentioned Titan Wrestler, it would be more obvious that you need to make that pick so that you can scale them, and it'll be a bit better signposted. But honestly, it should just be built in. It shouldn't be signposted. The Daredevil is multi-skill dependent, multi-attribute dependent. It can't also be skill feat dependent. You're just taking away too many build vectors that make the game fun, and I think a lot of those need to be built in. My ideal version of the Daredevil would allow you to pick athletics or acrobatics as an auto-scaling skill at level 1, make Daring Stunt work with acrobatics rather than just athletics for its trip, grapple, etc., offer you a whole bunch of level 1 and other low-level feats similar to Forceful Kickoff Stunt, etc., that can do a variety of things like using acrobatics or athletics to target reflex or fortitude, and build Titan Wrestler in, and perhaps make it scale to Gargantuan earlier than normal Titan Wrestler. And of course, make all those stunts apply to Titan Wrestler. All of those combined would be enough quality of life improvements for the Daredevil that you can't make wrong build decisions. Because right now, not picking Titan Wrestler is wrong. Not picking Acrobat Dedication is wrong. And I don't think the Daredevil should be designed like that. Now, another thing I noticed is that the Daredevil, its performance against boss fights is very caster-like. You are very reliant on understanding what save to target between AC, Reflex, and Fortitude. Remember when I was describing how I dealt with the T-Rex in my Daredevil playtest? T-Rexes have low reflex, so I went with Trip a lot more than I used Grapple or Shove. But what if I was fighting a high reflex enemy with the lower Fortitude? Well, there is that level 1 stunt I could use, right? The one that is effectively a reflavor Trip, but the important part of it is that I target Fortitude with my acrobatics rather than reflex with my athletics. And the reverse is true as well. While grapple is usually Fortitude, Wheeling Pull Stun affects their reflex. And I noticed that in this too. The Daredevil's biggest contribution to combat came from the fact that they were able to trip this very large dinosaur with obviously terrible reflex. And many might view this as a bad thing. I know there are people who don't like playing the save game, figuring out whether you want to hit AC, Reflex, or Fortitude. I think it's good. I think having marshals that participate in this game is good. If you don't like that gameplay loop, you can simply play any of the other marshals that don't care about that gameplay loop. It's great that there's a marshal who fundamentally cares about it without needing to rely on skill feats giving them specific actions that let them care for it. And remember, if you pick the Acrobat Dedication, you will probably free up some space to also have something like Demoralize or Bon Mot or Distracting Performance, helping you even further in this game by adding will to the saves you can target. So I find that the Daredevil's performance is very caster-like, unlike a lot of marshals when it comes to bosses, and I think that's a really good thing. Next up, teamwork blows up the Daredevil's value a lot. As a Flames Druid, I was putting up Wildfire, my focus spell, and Corrosive Muck, a rank 5 spell, a lot for the Daredevil to abuse, and they performed excellently. Wildfire notably does not have a it doesn't scale the damage you take restriction like a lot of set spells do. So every time a larger enemy was shoved, they would take a ton of damage. And Corrosive Muck meant that they were unable to reposition themselves and were locked into a combat they didn't want to take. The Titanosaur, once the Corrosive Muck landed on it, was never able to get to where it wanted in the combat. It was stuck fighting the Daredevil and the Slayer and never able to get back to us casters. And the Daredevil obviously makes this better, being able to shove enemies into a wildfire, trip them, or grapple them in a corrosive muck. All of this magnifies the value immensely, and I think that's fantastic. I think marshals that play nice with spellcasters are always a really fun thing to have, especially because of the community's general tendency to overvalue how much casters should support marshals and refuse to do anything in reverse. So a class like the Daredevil that has obvious synergies with spellcasters is great. Now, another negative I notice is that Flourish Overload is a real problem. The player wished to be able to do breakaway attack and pressing pummel, and it felt bad that he could not do that. And I agree with him. There's no real reason you shouldn't be able to do that. It's not that much damage. I think there needs to be a reevaluation of how many things the Daredevil has that say Flourish, and if you want to keep them with the Flourish trait because of thematic reasons, that's cool, but make them a lot more powerful. The Guardian has a Flourish Overload problem, but the Guardian's Flourish actions are freaking fantastic. It feels like you're spoiled for choice, whereas with the Daredevil, a lot of options do feel like, this really should not have had Flourish. And finally, there is a bit of an intuition issue with Daring Stunt always being one of your best openers. Daring Stunt fundamentally has the risky trait. It requires you to stride. Now, nothing's stopping you from striding away, striding back, and doing your thing. So there were turns where the Daredevil player started already in melee and was like, well, I want to use something risky to open my turn with. Let me use breakaway attack followed by, say, trip up or pressing pummel. On paper, that looks like the most intuitive and reasonable way to start a turn where you're already in melee, but it would have just been strictly better for that player to Daring Stunt, stride away from the boss, come back in and trip the boss, and then use pressing pummel or trip up. And that's weird. A lot of players are not going to think of run away and come back in the same action as something you actually want to do. Turn-based games are supposed to simulate this reality that's happening in real time. And ping-ponging like that in the span of one action just to get risky, it breaks that simulation, in my opinion. I think Daring Stunt needs two modes. One where you move and do something, the other where you get a benefit for already having been in melee. Maybe something like a +1 circumstance bonus if you choose not to stride or leap. I don't know, maybe that's too much, maybe a flat math boost isn't the way to go about it, but some benefit for using Daring Stunt while already in melee will more obviously signpost to players that this is often their best opener, because Daredevils are not damage dealers, they're controllers dealing incidental damage. On a related note, breakaway attack feeling like an opener is actually poor signposting as well. I think there were exactly 0 circumstances where that player used breakaway attack where it would not have been better to use Daring Stunt. So either boost breakaway attack or make it more obviously signposted as a follow-up to your primary thing of Daring Stunt. Maybe breakaway attack deserves press and not flourish, or maybe it needs to be flexible. You can do it with flourish or with press. I don't know, there's many combinations, but basically, if the Daredevil is intended to be using Daring Stunt on damn near 100% of their turns, make it more obvious and make it look less fiddly when used in melee. If they're not intended to use that as their opener on damn near 100% of their turns, then give them better opening options. Boost breakaway attack, maybe boost rushing stride a little even, and that way there'll be more options for what you do to open your turn. Either boost is fine, but one of those needs to be given. Now let's talk about the Slayer in this playtest. First up, there was one bad takeaway. On the Hunt had a really poor showing here. In the playtest where I played a Slayer, On the Hunt was fantastic. It was on for 8 out of 11 turns. In the second playtest, it was still on the majority of the time. In this playtest, we had 3 turns where On the Hunt was on across 3 whole combats that took maybe 13, 14 rounds total. So that was not a good showing. Why did this happen? Well, combats 2 and 3 were single boss fights. Nobody was dropping a 0 HP in a single boss fight. A player could have dropped a 0 HP, but we had a healing font cleric who was really good at her job. So the only way for the player to get on the hunt was for us to critically hit the quarry. We simply never crit the cave worm, We simply never crit the Titanosaur. And notably, we did critically succeed, but we never critically hit. The Daredevil critically succeeded at a trip attempt. The Slayer critically succeeded at recall knowledge attempts. I had the enemy critically fail against my spells simply because of the number of spells I was using. At one point, a natural one was rolled, even though it was a boss. But none of that mattered. None of that mattered compared to the fact that they were never critically hit, and the trigger is specifically critically hitting. And in Combat 1, something peculiar happened. We only dropped one enemy to 0 HP out of 3, and the player didn't have a quarry. Why? Because we had a secondary objective in that combat, non-lethally breaking out the centipedes from an affliction so they stop attacking us. And that meant only the tick swarm actually dropped to 0 HP, the centipedes never did. And this feels odd. The Slayer is a prep marshal. I would expect the Slayer to shine in combats where a secondary objective matters, but somehow that made the Slayer's core toolkit shut down a little. Now I want you to understand, this is a corner case. Having a lot of enemies on field, but none of them dropping to 0 HP is an anomaly. The issue with the boss fights is not an anomaly, and I'll get into that later, but Combat 1's issue is an anomaly. If Combat 1 was relatively normal, we would have probably had 4 to 5 turns of On the Hunt throughout the day, which would have been pretty okay performance at least. Still not great, but okay. And of course, part of the issue here is just the build. Blood Rush was a good build choice. It guaranteed 2 turns of Quickened in this combat. But you know what else would have been a good build choice to help you get Quickened? Relentless Counterstrike. As a warded male Slayer, I think there were about 4 different turns where their armored shelter was raised and the enemy missed, and all of these would have triggered Quickened. But in my opinion, given how core On the Hunt is to the Slayer performing well, they shouldn't have to rely on picking the right feats to have it trigger often. I think the triggers need to be expanded at a baseline. Maybe as you level up, you automatically add more triggers based on your subclass. So for example, the Blade subclass gets when you miss an enemy, it triggers, and then Warded Male gets when an enemy misses you, it triggers, and then you shouldn't have to pick feats to get those triggers instead. In my opinion, that's not the best design for something so core. So I hope Paizo is able to iron out On the Hunt's triggering frequency by the final release. And I gotta say, the performance against that final boss, the Titanosaur, felt bad. It wasn't objectively bad, more on that later, but dear God, it did not feel good. The problem is that On the Hunt is your thing. It's your core thing, and you are way too reliant on team support for the boss fight. Now, of course, there is a dynamic in boss fights. Nobody can solo a boss fight. Everyone needs team support. The way they generally go is that casters are self-sufficient offensively, but they are pretty inefficient in an action sense, and they need defensive help. And marshals usually need help on both the offensive and defensive front. Remember, their defenses are better than a caster's, but you're not standing against a boss for more than 2 turns max, even as a marshal. But their efficiency is what brings value. So a caster, for example, can contribute by either directly hurting the enemy with their amazing, reliable offenses, or boosting their martial allies' offenses and or defenses via things like healing and buffing, using things like Courageous Anthem, Fortissimo composition, Synesthesia, etc. And that is a dynamic the Slayer would enjoy a lot, because the Slayer relies on critical hits, and so if the party looks something like Cleric, Bard, Slayer, Daredevil, the Slayer would be in love. The Daredevil is constantly tripping foes, giving them off guard. The Bard is giving them something like Fortissimo and Synesthesia, and they're critting a lot, which means On the Hunt is happening a lot, which means they're getting their full martial efficiency. But they rely on that support to have that martial efficiency. If this Slayer was any other martial, they wouldn't be relying on my Druid to be supporting them offensively. My Druid would just get you to the offensive things that I did, and they would use their own efficiency to contribute. If the frontliner was a monk, their efficiency would come out in things like Flurry of Blows, Flurry of Maneuvers, etc. And I talked about the Daredevil having similar efficiency in my previous slide about the Daredevil, where I kept bullying that T-Rex boss. If this was a fighter or a rogue, their efficiency would come out from the sheer number of strikes they make across both their turn and off their turn. And likewise, a ranger would bring that efficiency via things like hunted shot and twin takedown. The guardian or champion would get it via their amazing reactions. No matter how you look at it, any martial character, if they don't get support from something like a bard helping them offensively, they can still contribute using their action efficiency. And then that character, like instead of a bard, it was my druid, is doing their own contributions offensively. So it still works, but it doesn't work for the Slayer because their efficiency comes from critical hits in boss fights, which means if you don't have something like a bard supporting you, you fizzle out. Your performance in boss fights don't feel that great. And I think that is a legitimate problem. This again just goes back to point one. If On the Hunt had more frequent and more convenient triggers, this just wouldn't be that much of an issue. This Slayer, I counted, would have had 3 more On the Hunt triggers across the session if they had Relentless Counterstrike. They didn't have Relentless Counterstrike, but it should just be built into their chassis, in my opinion, to prevent this problem from happening, because no class should be so dependent on party composition that their way of contributing to boss fights goes away if the casters are not cheerleading them. I don't think that's okay design for them. So the Slayer definitely needs On the Hunt improvements, especially in boss fight situations. And finally, my suspicion that Warded Male is the best subclass was very easily confirmed. The sheer action economy you get by being a survivable class outweighs nearly everything else you can do. In that final fight, the Slayer actually never landed a hit. I think maybe they landed 1, but I think it was 0. All of the damage for that fight actually came from the backline. My druid did the most damage by having layered amazing offensive primal spells like Cinder Swarm, Corrosive Muck, Explosive Barrage, etc. But the cleric also got to contribute to the offense. Why is that? Because the Warded Male Slayer did not need that much healing. Turn 1 went poorly, the cleric had to heal all 3 of us, and then never bothered healing the Slayer again. I think she healed the Daredevil 1 more time, but the Slayer simply was never in danger of dropping to 0 HP after that first turn because of how powerful their defenses were. They were resisting so much damage, and they had such a high armor class that it truly did not matter. They were just in the front line, tanking a 3-level higher boss and not needing that much healing, which meant the cleric could use offensive spells, and spellcaster offenses are amazing against bosses. And remember, the party planned this. The Daredevil is a skirmisher. I had thrown a Corrosive Muck into the mix. It was really hard for that Titanosaur with its not so great movement speed to get out of the Corrosive Muck, so they were forced to engage the Slayer pretty much the whole time. And that meant our party could really coordinate and take down the boss, even though the Slayer never landed a hit. And this is why I said the performance felt bad, but objectively was still fine. So I don't know. Maybe the problem here is that the best part of the Slayer's performance came from their passives, and their actives never mattered. Maybe the power budget needs a shift rather than an increase. Maybe Warded Male needs to be made into a more active subclass. Maybe other subclasses need to be brought up to par with Warded Male. And then in that case, you wouldn't need On the Hunt boosts, or just boost On the Hunt, let it trigger more frequently, let the Slayer have their pseudo 4-action economy. They've kind of earned it by their rest of their chassis being so weird. Regardless of how you go about it, there is a bit of a discrepancy here where the best subclass doesn't feel the best to play, especially in boss fights, even when it's doing well. And I think that needs improvement. So my vote would be to make On the Hunt better, more frequently triggered, and make all those triggers baseline rather than feats, because I think On the Hunt is the most fun part of playing a Slayer. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, build in subclass-specific ways of using your extra action economy more obviously, so you don't have to rely on out-of-class things like archetypes or consumables to abuse that 4-action economy. So let's talk about some of the overall takeaways that I've had across all of these playtests. First up, there is a unifying design space for both of these classes. They're both incredibly action-efficient martials. Both of them effectively have a 4-action economy. I will say, I think the Daredevil is a little more action-efficient. Why is that? Well, the Slayer has quickened, but quickened is a condition other things in the game can give you. A Daredevil's fourth action doesn't come from quickened, it comes from things like flourish and risky and daring stunt being once per round but not flourish. All of these together make it feel like the Daredevil gets 4 actions that could then stack with quickened if somebody gives you loose times arrow or haste or a potion of quickness, whereas for a Slayer that's not the case. They're actual factual quickened. So the Daredevil probably has the best action economy in the game, followed by, let's say, the Monk and the Guardian, and then the Slayer would come in a little after all 3 of those. So both classes are way more action efficient than the average Marshal. Marshals tend to be pretty damn efficient already. These classes are way better at that. And I have seen some people dismiss this as a boring design niche because, oh, they're just action efficient Marshals. I don't agree that that's the case. That's just the unifying design space between the two of them, but then they both have a lot of sauce going for them separately. The Daredevil is designed to reward risky play. I was solo skirmishing a boss that was 2 levels higher than me as an 8 HP Marshal in light armor without a shield, without a caster healing me or giving me defensive buffs. That's risky, but I felt appropriately rewarded for it. And of course, it rewards skirmishing and single target control. Single target control in that caster-like way I mentioned, where you feel like you should be switching between AC, reflex, and fortitude depending on your enemy, and of course skirmishing via things like daring stunt to trip or shove enemies, and then using stride, forceful kickoff stunts, scrambling retreat, etc. to always be in the perfect position that you want to be in. Slayer rewards pre-encounter preparation. I complained that not being able to switch the reinforced in the middle of the day felt a little bad, but ultimately choosing the right reinforced options at the start of the day does reward preparation. In the same way prepared spellcasters can be good, the Slayer can also feel pretty damn good about this. And it rewards versatility in your 4th actions. It's sort of the spiritual inverse of the Daredevil. The Daredevil kind of always wants to start with daring stunt and then figure out the rest of their turn from there. The Slayer, on the other hand, kind of wants to have just a whole bunch of weird stuff to do. Alchemical items, all kinds of consumables, because you just have such a liberated action economy at a baseline. But of course, both of the classes need ironing out. They need quality of life upgrades, but the chassis for both the classes are solid. I have seen so many people dismiss these classes being dead on arrival. I really could not disagree more. I think both classes are pretty close to being good. They're much closer to being good than, say, the Guardian playtest was, and look how the Guardian turned out in the end. It turned out fantastically, and I have high hopes for these classes because I have been really enjoying the creative and cool design spaces that Paizo was exploring with the new Marshals. Now, there's something that needs to be said. Both of these classes are pretty damn complex. Please account for that when looking at the feedback. I have seen a lot of folks sort of have misconceptions about these classes' overall power level and power budget simply because they're evaluating it like they're meant to be simple at the floor, high floor Marshals. This is not the case. There are a lot of people who are just looking at stunt damage, seeing the numbers look like Swashbuckler's finisher damage, and then deciding that because stunt damage is harder to trigger, and therefore the Daredevil sucks. This is not true. That's an overly simple and incorrect way of looking at the Daredevil. The Daredevil's chassis is way better than just stunt damage. And ultimately, when you are giving feedback to Paizo, if you plan to, I hope you give it with context of how you're looking at it. If you built a Daredevil to just make strikes, you probably had a pretty bad time. The Daredevil is a controller. The Daredevil is a skirmisher. If you just go into melee and spend 3 actions striking, even if you're getting lucky, you're probably going to have pretty below par performance. But that is also just not the way to play the Daredevil, and that's okay. It's okay for there to be complex Marshals who have different playstyles than other Marshals. A commander who spams strikes is also going to suck. That doesn't mean the commander sucks, it just means the commander was built with a different thing in mind. And of course, poor signposting is a real issue. I think the Daredevil needs cleaner, more upfront signposting about being a controller. I think it needs a lot of quality of life changes built in so you feel incentivized to control. And likewise, I think the Slayer needs a lot of quality of life changes to on the hunt to need a little less babysitting, especially in boss fights. That is all true. But I really hope that you're not providing feedback based on a misevaluation of these classes, and if you are, I really hope Paizo is able to differentiate real signposting issues from skill issues. And I apologize. I know that's a mean sentiment. I know that's often used as a gatekeepy sentiment, but there is a real problem of people simply going into these complex classes, playing them in a way that's very against their design philosophy, and being surprised that that performs poorly, and then using that to conclude the classes suck. I have seen people go into the Slayer convinced that the only thing they're going to do is spam the same 2-action Honed Strike again and again because Bloodseeking Blade is the best subclass. Spamming the same 2-action strike is never a good idea on any martial. You need variety on every single martial, but like if you're playing a more baseline simple martial, like say a slam down fighter or a double slice fighter, you could get away with it. The simple options get you most of the way to your ceiling on some classes. The Slayer is not like that. If you play it in a spammy way, it will underperform. If you play the Daredevil in a spammy way, aside from Daring Stunt being so clearly amazing and spammable, it will underperform. You won't be able to spam in the same way. You have to sequence your turns like a martial controller. You have to sequence the Slayer's turns like someone who is ever prepared and trying to abuse that 4th action. And I know some folks may not like that. Some folks don't like that playstyle. But I want complex martials to exist, and I want them to be rewarded. I'm a little tired of strike maxing. I'm a little tired of the most common advice given to martials being, take a mapless strike on your turn, then set up a way to get mapless strikes off turn. That is really frequent advice, and while I don't even think that's universally optimal, it clearly is one of the most popular pieces of optimization advice given, and I'm happy to see classes that very obviously break away from that. I'm happy that commanders, guardians, non-justice champions, monks break away from that advice and do other things both on turn and off turn, and I'm glad that they're adding the Daredevil and Slayer to that roster. If you don't like the complex martials, there are so many other options that you can play that let you get most of the way to the ceiling through simple options, and I think your opinion should not warp this playtest that's clearly designed to reward complex playstyles. So if you're giving Paizo feedback, I hope you're able to keep in perspective that these martials are not trying to be simple and evaluate them for what they're trying to be. And I hope that Paizo is able to filter out negative feedback based on people playing these martials like their other martials and being disappointed, even though their design is very different than these other martials. And finally, to end on a really positive note, both of these classes are some of the most fun I have had with martials. Paizo just needs to make these fun builds easier to build right. But when built right, they sing. My Slayer felt fantastic. I really enjoyed using the combination weapon. Being a switch hitter is fun. Having access to consumables in your offhand, including specialty ammo, is fun. And then being able to pivot into athletics when needed was also pretty damn fun. And I could tell that the way I built my Slayer was actually cleaner than any other character would have been allowed to use combination weapons, even a trigger brand gunslinger. And likewise, my Daredevil had so many cinematic scenes because of just how amazing and cool and powerful their action economy is. I think I still prefer the Commander and Guardian to both of these classes, but these classes are still in playtest and came real close. So maybe in the final release, they'll be even better. I certainly hope so. That will be all for today's video, folks. If you had a negative view of either or both of the Slayer and Daredevil, I really hope I have convinced you otherwise. I'll be completely honest. I don't fully understand why there's so much negative feedback surrounding both of these two classes. They feel good. They're much closer to perfection than the Guardian was in its playtest. And somehow I'm getting the impression the Guardian had a more positive reception than this did, and the Guardian did not have a great reception. It was still pretty damn negative. I don't know, maybe this is a bias on my part, but I feel like the community has become much more negative over the past 8 months or so in online Pathfinder spaces, and I really hope that that passes. These two classes are fun and cool, and they're clearly delivering on the thing they're intended to do. And it's fine if you don't want to engage in the thing they're intended to do, but that doesn't make them bad classes. The Thaumaturge isn't a bad class because I personally think that it's kind of lame that you're just a rumor monger and not actually an intelligent and well-researched monster hunter. And likewise, the Daredevil is not a bad class just because you wanted it to be another damage dealer. You have 10 other options for damage dealers, and if you evaluate the Daredevil as the controller skirmisher hybrid it is, it's a fantastic class that's pretty close to being good with some quality of life adjustments. Likewise, the Slayer, if you evaluate it for the monster hunter it is, it delivers perfectly on that fantasy. It is not a ranger clone. It is so much more than that. And it's a pretty unique playstyle that lets us do things that martials usually may not be able to do easily. So I really hope I've convinced some of you, hopefully many of you, that these classes are good, that they're worth a shot, that Paizo might be cooking, and that if we give them more granular and pointed feedback, they'll be able to make something amazing in the final release rather than just dismissing what they're cooking as being clones of existing classes or just bad performers, because they're not. They're not clones and they perform great when built right. All that being said, if you enjoyed this video, please like and comment. If you'd like to see more of my content in the future, please subscribe. I have recently been on more of a kick of reviewing some Paizo stuff rather than my usual math finding, and that has been partially due to timing. There's just been a lot in the past 2 months coming out, and it's partially been because I've just been busy myself. That being said, I have a video cooking up, probably 2 videos from now, where I'm going to be doing some detailed mathematical deep dives into something in the system that I think people don't explore much. So stay tuned for that. It'll probably come out in a week and a half from the release of this video. And please subscribe and click the notifications bell if you want to see my videos as soon as they come out. If you can, join a channel membership. It is the most direct way to support me. Regardless, I hope I'll see you next time. Mathfinder out.